April 3rd, 1954, 3:47 a.m. The White House. The phone on the duty officer's desk rang. He had been half asleep, slumped over reports from the Far East. The sound jolted him upright. He grabbed the receiver. Situation room. The voice on the other end was the communications officer at the State Department. His words came fast, breathless. "We have an urgent cable from Paris. Eyes only for the president. You need to wake the National Security Advisor, now." The duty officer felt his stomach tighten. In 2 years working the night shift, he had never been told to wake anyone at this hour, unless it was an emergency. He pulled the decoded cable from the pneumatic tube. His hands started shaking as he read it. Urgent. Classification. Top secret. President Eisenhower. French Ministry of Defense. Paris. Dien Bien Phu Garrison. Critical situation. Request immediate American military intervention. 15,000 French soldiers surrounded. Runway destroyed. Supplies exhausted. Situation critical. Reporting U.S. carrier-based airstrikes within 48 hours or entire garrison will be lost. He read it again, then a third time. 15,000 men surrounded, dying. France was begging America to save them. He picked up the red phone, direct line to the National Security Advisor's home. 3 rings. 4. Finally, a groggy voice. "This better be important. Sir, you need to see this cable, right now." By 9 a.m., the Oval Office was filled with the most powerful men in the American government. Vice President Richard Nixon sat on the edge of his chair, reading the cable for the 3rd time. His face was flushed. His jaw was set. Secretary of State John Foster Dulles stood by the window, arms crossed. His usual calm demeanor was gone. He looked like a man watching his entire foreign policy unravel in real time. Admiral Arthur Radford, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, had a leather folder under his arm. Inside was a strike plan he had been working on for weeks. He had known this moment was coming. They were all waiting for President Dwight D. Eisenhower. The door opened. Eisenhower walked in. No aide. No secretary. Just the president, alone with his thoughts. He sat down at his desk without a word. The cable was already there, placed in the exact center of his blotter. He read it slowly. His face showed nothing, but his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. When he finished, he looked up at the men in his office. "Gentlemen," he said quietly, "tell me what you think." Nixon spoke first. He always spoke first. "Mr. President, we cannot allow this fortress to fall. If we do nothing, we hand Southeast Asia to the communists. Thailand falls next, then Burma. Indonesia. Eventually, the Philippines." He leaned. "If Vietnam falls and we stood by and did nothing, the Democrats will crucify us. They'll say we lost Asia." Dulles was next. The Secretary of State had been preparing for this conversation for weeks. "Sir, in January I announced the doctrine of massive retaliation. I told the world that communist aggression would be met with instant American response, by means and at places of our choosing." His voice was urgent. "The world is watching. Moscow is watching. Beijing is watching. If we fail to act now, every ally from Seoul to Saigon will question whether American security guarantees mean anything." He paused. "Our credibility is on the line." Admiral Radford placed his leather folder on Eisenhower's desk. "Mr. President, I have the operational plan ready. Codename Operation Vulture." He opened the folder to a map of northern Vietnam. 2 aircraft carriers, the USS Essex and USS Boxer, are currently in the South China Sea. They can be on station off the coast of Vietnam within 36 hours. He pointed to the map. "We launch 60 aircraft, A-1 Sky Raiders armed with 500-pound bombs and napalm. The strike targets Viet Minh artillery positions in the hills surrounding Dien Bien Phu." Radford looked directly at Eisenhower. 2 days of concentrated bombing, Mr. President. The Viet Minh artillery will be destroyed. French reinforcements can then break the siege and relieve the garrison." He closed the folder. "American ground troops will not be necessary. Air power alone will turn the tide." The room fell silent. Everyone was looking at Eisenhower. The president picked up Radford's folder. He opened it, read the operational details slowly, studied the maps, examined the target lists. The only sound in the room was the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Finally, Eisenhower looked up. His voice was quiet, almost conversational. But every man in that room felt the weight behind the words. "Admiral, I have one question. Radford straightened. Yes, sir? What happens after the bombing stops? Radford blinked. Sir, The French have been fighting in Vietnam for 8 years, Eisenhower continued. They have 200,000 troops there. They have tanks, artillery, air support. And they're losing. He tapped the folder. If our carrier strikes save this garrison today, and that's a big if, what happens tomorrow? What happens next week? Next month? He looked around the room. Are we prepared to occupy Vietnam indefinitely? Are we prepared to fight a ground war in Asian jungles against an enemy that has the support of the local population? Silence. Because I've commanded armies, gentlemen. I sent men to die on the beaches of Normandy. I've written letters to mothers explaining why their sons aren't coming home. His voice was still quiet, still calm, but now there was steel in it. And I will not write those letters for a war we cannot win. He closed the folder and slid it back across the desk. I want real answers, not promises, not political talking points. I want someone to tell me, in clear, specific terms, what happens after we drop the first bomb. Nobody spoke. Eisenhower stood up. Meeting adjourned. Come back when you have answers. The men filed out silently. Only Nixon lingered by the door, as if he wanted to say something. Eisenhower looked at him. Dick, unless you can answer my question, we have nothing more to discuss. Nixon left. Eisenhower sat back down at his desk. He pulled out a yellow legal pad and began writing notes. Notes that would become the foundation of a decision that would save 58,000 American lives. But in that moment, on that morning, nobody in Washington knew what was coming. They only knew that the president had asked a question nobody could answer. To understand why Eisenhower's question mattered, you need to know what was happening 8,000 miles away, in a valley that would become the graveyard of French colonial ambitions. November 20th, 1953. Dien Bien Phu, northern Vietnam. French General Henri Navarre stood on a hilltop overlooking the valley below. The morning mist was just beginning to burn off. Sunlight broke through the jungle canopy in golden shafts. It was beautiful, and it was perfect. Perfect terrain for what Navarre had in mind. For 7 years, France had been fighting the Viet Minh, communist-led forces trying to end French colonial rule in Indochina. 7 years of brutal jungle warfare, ambushes on mountain roads, supply convoys torn apart, outposts overrun in the middle of the night. The French couldn't find the enemy. The Viet Minh would strike and melt back into the jungle before French reinforcements could arrive. Navarre was done chasing ghosts. He was going to make the enemy come to him. The valley of Dien Bien Phu was 10 miles long and 6 miles wide. It had an airstrip, crude but functional. Cargo planes could land and bring in supplies, reinforcements, heavy equipment. Navarre's plan was elegant in its simplicity. Fly 15,000 French soldiers into the valley. Build fortified positions with artillery support. Create a fortress in the middle of Viet Minh territory. A fist thrust directly into the enemy's face. The Viet Minh would have no choice but to attack. They couldn't allow a French stronghold to sit in the middle of their supply routes. And when they attacked, French artillery and air power would annihilate them in open battle. It was textbook military doctrine, everything Napoleon would have approved. The kind of decisive engagement that won wars. Navarre turned to his staff officers. This is where we win. This is where we destroy them. His intelligence officer, a young captain who had studied the terrain carefully, cleared his throat. General, I have some concerns about the surrounding hills. If the enemy positions artillery, Navarre cut him off with a wave. The Viet Minh have no heavy artillery, and even if they did, they could never transport it through 50 miles of jungle with no roads. He pointed at the hills. Those slopes are too steep. The jungle is too dense. It's impossible. The captain said nothing more, but he looked at those hills with growing unease. Over the next month, French transport planes flew mission after mission into Dien Bien Phu. They brought in troops, artillery pieces, ammunition, food, medical supplies, everything needed to sustain 15,000 men. The fortress took shape. Strong points were built and given women's names: Isabelle, Beatrice, Gabrielle, Anne-Marie, Huguette. French artillery, 105mm howitzers, were positioned to cover every approach to the valley. Anti-aircraft guns were set up to defend against any Viet Minh planes. By early March 1954, Dien Bien Phu looked impregnable. French officers walked the perimeter with confidence. This was a fortress that could withstand anything the Viet Minh could throw at it. 60 miles to the north, General Vo Nguyen Giap was smiling. Giap had spent his entire adult life fighting foreign invaders. First, the Japanese occupation during World War II, then the French return after 1945. He had learned one fundamental lesson that the French kept forgetting. Never fight the way your enemy expects you to fight. When Giap's scouts reported that the French were building a fortress at Dien Bien Phu, he immediately understood what Navarre had done. The French hadn't built a fortress. They had built a cage, and they had locked themselves inside. Giap called his commanders together. He spread a map of Dien Bien Phu on the table. The French believe we cannot bring heavy artillery through the jungle. They believe the terrain is impossible. He looked at each commander in turn. We will prove them wrong. January to March 1954. What happened over the next 3 months was one of the greatest logistical achievements in military history. General Giap ordered every heavy gun the Viet Minh possessed to be moved to the hills surrounding Dien Bien Phu. Over 200 artillery pieces, Soviet-built 105mm howitzers, 75mm mountain guns, Stalin organs, Katyusha rocket launchers that could fire 16 rockets in 7 seconds, anti-aircraft guns to shoot down French supply planes. The problem? The guns weighed tons. The jungle had no roads. The terrain was mountainous. Rivers cut through every approach route. The French were right. It was impossible, unless you were willing to do the impossible. Giap mobilized 20,000 civilian laborers, peasants from villages across northern Vietnam. They were told, "Carry these guns to the hills. Our independence depends on it." They disassembled the howitzers into components that could be carried by hand. A gun barrel, a wheeled carriage, ammunition shells, each one carried individually. They built paths through jungle that wasn't on any map. They cut steps into mountainsides. They constructed bamboo bridges across rivers that could support the weight of artillery pieces. When paths were too steep for wheels, they used ropes and human muscle. 50 men would haul a single gun barrel up a slope, inch by inch, hour after hour. They dug tunnels through ridgelines so guns could be positioned without being visible from the air. French reconnaissance planes flew over every day, taking photos. They saw jungle. They saw hills. They never saw the guns. At night, under the cover of darkness, the artillery was positioned. Carefully, precisely, all pointing down into the valley where 15,000 French soldiers were living in false confidence. By March 13, 1954, over 200 Viet Minh artillery pieces were hidden in the hills surrounding Dien Bien Phu. The French had no idea. March 13, 1954, 5:17 p.m. Colonel Charles Perroth, the French artillery commander, was having dinner when the first shell hit. He heard the whistle, the distinctive sound of an incoming artillery round, then the explosion. Close. Too close. He dropped his fork and ran outside. Another shell hit. Then another. Then the sky erupted, hundreds of shells, falling like rain. Perroth ran to his command bunker. His officers were screaming coordinates into radios. French artillery was firing back blindly into the hills. "How many guns?" Perroth shouted over the explosions. One of his officers was at a map, trying to triangulate enemy positions based on the incoming fire. "Sir, we count at least 60, maybe 100. Perroth felt his stomach drop to his feet. He had personally assured General Navarre, promised him, that the Viet Minh had no heavy artillery, that even if they did, they could never position it in those hills. He had been catastrophically wrong. For 3 hours, the bombardment continued. Viet Minh shells fell with devastating accuracy on French positions. Strong Point Beatrice, one of the outlying fortifications, was being systematically destroyed. Ammunition dumps exploded in massive fireballs. Bunkers collapsed. Men died screaming under tons of earth. French artillery tried to return fire, but they couldn't see the enemy guns. The Viet Minh had dug them into caves and tunnels. French shells exploded harmlessly on the hillsides. By midnight, Strong Point Beatrice had fallen. Over 500 French soldiers dead or captured. The fortress that was supposed to be impregnable had lost a major position on the first day. Colonel Perroth walked back to his bunker. His officers tried to brief him on ammunition reserves, casualty reports, requests for reinforcements. He wasn't listening. His mind was replaying his promise to Navarre, his absolute certainty that this couldn't happen. He had been wrong, and men had died because of it. March 14, 1954, 4 a.m. One of Perrault's aides found him in his bunker. The colonel had pulled the pin on a grenade and held it to his chest. He was dead. The artillery commander had killed himself rather than face the consequences of his catastrophic miscalculation. When General Christian de Castries, overall commander at Dien Bien Phu, heard the news, he knew what it meant. If Perrault, the most experienced artillery officer in Indochina, believed the situation was hopeless, then it probably was. March 14th to 27th, 1954. Over the next 2 weeks, the situation deteriorated rapidly. Viet Minh artillery destroyed the airstrip. No planes could land. All supplies had to be parachuted in, but half the drops landed in Viet Minh-controlled territory because anti-aircraft fire forced French planes to fly too high. French soldiers went on half rations, then quarter rations. Men were eating rats caught in the trenches. The wounded couldn't be evacuated. The field hospital was overwhelmed. Doctors operated by flashlight, with no anesthesia. Men died from infections that would have been minor wounds in a real hospital. And the Viet Minh weren't just shelling, they were digging. Every night, Viet Minh soldiers dug trenches, advancing toward French positions inch by inch. The same trench warfare tactics used in World War I. Slow, methodical, unstoppable. French officers sent increasingly desperate messages to Paris. We need immediate relief. Air support insufficient. American intervention essential. The French government forwarded these messages to Washington. The subtext was clear. We funded your Marshall Plan. We supported NATO. Now we need you. Either American bombers save Dien Bien Phu, or 15,000 French soldiers die on international television. April 4th, 1954, the Pentagon. While Eisenhower's advisors were scrambling to answer his question, another conversation was happening. General Matthew Ridgway, Army Chief of Staff, sat in his office reading the same operational plan Radford had shown the president. Ridgway was different from the other military leaders pushing for intervention. He had commanded the 8th Army in Korea. He knew what fighting in Asia actually required. He picked up his phone. Get me a team to Vietnam. I want terrain assessment, infrastructure analysis, logistical requirements. Everything. His aide hesitated. Sir, the Secretary of Defense hasn't authorized. I'm authorizing it, Ridgway interrupted. The president asked a question. I'm going to give him an answer. April 7th to 15th, 1954. Ridgway's assessment team, Army engineers and intelligence officers, spent a week in Saigon and the Vietnamese countryside. They returned with a report that would change history. April 16th, 1954. Ridgway requested a private meeting with Eisenhower. No aides, no stenographers, no political advisors, just 2 soldiers who had seen war. Eisenhower gestured to a chair. Matt, what did you find? Ridgway placed a single document on the president's desk. Sir, you asked what happens after the bombing stops. This is the answer. Eisenhower opened the report. As he read, his face grew darker. 1. Airstrikes alone will accomplish nothing permanent. Viet Minh forces will retreat into jungle terrain during bombing and return when aircraft leave. This pattern has been observed for 7 years of French air operations. 2. Saving Dien Bien Phu temporarily would require American ground troops to hold the position and supply lines. 7. Divisions. 3. Vietnam terrain is significantly worse than Korea. No functional road network outside major cities. 80% jungle/mountain terrain, unsuitable for mechanized warfare. Monsoon season makes air support impossible, 4 months per year. No friendly ports for supply. 4. If China intervenes, force requirement increases to 12 divisions. 5. Estimated American casualties in first year, 25,000 to 40,000 KIA. French are not fighting a military war. They are fighting a political war to preserve colonial control. Vietnamese population, including non-communists, oppose French rule. American intervention would be seen as replacing one colonial master with another. Do not intervene. Eisenhower read the report twice. Then he looked up at Ridgway. Matt, what's your personal opinion? Ridgway's answer was blunt. Sir, the French have been there 8 years with 200,000 troops. They're losing. How many American boys do we send to hold what France can't defend? Eisenhower nodded slowly. And if we don't intervene? The fortress falls. France negotiates a settlement. Vietnam is probably divided between North and South. Ridgway paused. but 58,000 American soldiers come home alive who would have died in Vietnamese jungles. The number was specific. Ridgway's team had calculated projected casualties over 10 years of counterinsurgency operations. 58,000. Eisenhower stared at the number. That's more than we lost in Korea. Yes, sir. Vietnam would be worse than Korea. No defensive perimeter. No UN support. Fighting an enemy with popular support in a terrain that favors guerrilla tactics. Eisenhower closed the report. Thank you, Matt. This is exactly what I needed. After Ridgway left, Eisenhower sat alone with the report for a long time. He thought about the 405,000 Americans who died in World War II, the letters he had written to their families. He thought about Korea, 33,000 Americans dead in 3 years. Now his advisors wanted him to send troops into another Asian war, one that Ridgway projected would kill even more Americans. For what? To preserve French colonialism? Eisenhower made a decision in that moment, a decision he would stick to no matter how much pressure built. But first, he needed political cover. April 25, 1954, 10 Downing Street, London. John Foster Dulles sat across from Winston Churchill in the Prime Minister's study. Churchill was 79 years old. His hands shook slightly. His hearing was failing, but his eyes were still sharp. Dulles had flown to London with one mission: convince Britain to join American intervention in Vietnam. If Britain joined, congressional leaders had promised to support Eisenhower. The intervention would be multilateral, not unilateral. Dulles made his pitch: the domino theory, communist expansion, the need to stop Soviet influence in Southeast Asia. Churchill listened without interrupting. When Dulles finished, there was a long silence. Finally, Churchill spoke. His voice was quiet but firm. Mr. Secretary, I have known many adventures in my long life. I have fought in colonial wars, in Sudan, in South Africa, on the northwest frontier of India. He looked directly at Dulles. I know what you are facing in Vietnam. Another pause. The Vietnamese are not fighting for communism. They are fighting to end foreign rule. They fought the Chinese for 1,000 years. They will fight you just as long. Dulles tried to interrupt. Churchill raised a hand. I coined the phrase Iron Curtain. I have been warning about Soviet expansion since before it was fashionable. But I also know a lost cause when I see one. His voice grew harder. France is trying to preserve an empire. The world has moved on. Colonial rule is finished. Churchill stood up. The meeting was over. It is better to jaw than to war, Mr. Secretary. Britain will not participate in military intervention in Indochina. Dulles flew back to Washington empty-handed. He briefed Eisenhower on Churchill's refusal. Eisenhower nodded. That gives us the political cover we need. Congress won't support unilateral intervention. Dulles looked surprised. Sir, we could still... No, John, Eisenhower said quietly. Churchill gave me the excuse I needed, but I had already made my decision. April 29, 1954, final cabinet meeting. Every major figure in the Eisenhower administration was present: the National Security Council, the Joint Chiefs, congressional leaders. Everyone spoke. Everyone made their case. Dulles argued credibility. Nixon argued politics. Radford argued military capability. When they finished, Eisenhower stood up. He walked to the window and looked out at the Rose Garden. Then he turned to face them. Gentlemen, I have commanded millions of men. I have sent them into battle, knowing many would not return. I have written letters to mothers and wives, explaining why their sons and husbands died. His voice was calm, absolutely calm, which made the words hit harder. I will not write those letters for a colonial war. I will not send American boys to die preserving French empire. He looked at each man in turn. The Vietnamese do not want us there. The French are fighting to preserve control they lost the moral right to hold. We cannot win this war because the people we would be fighting for do not want us to fight. Nixon started to speak. Eisenhower raised his hand. Dick, you want me to intervene to help Republican chances in November. I will not trade American lives for political advantage. He looked at Radford. Admiral, you promise air power will be sufficient. The Air Force made the same promise about Germany in 1944. We still needed millions of soldiers to win. Why would Vietnam be different? Finally, he looked at Dulles. John, you ask about American credibility. I ask, what happens to American credibility when we fight a war we cannot win? When we become the new colonial master? When thousands of American boys come home in coffins? The room was silent. The decision is final. There will be no American military intervention at Dien Bien Phu. May 7, 1954. After 56 days of siege, Dien Bien Phu fell. 2,293 French soldiers dead. 11,721 captured. Most would spend years in Viet Minh prison camps. Thousands would never come home. The fortress that was supposed to be impregnable had become a death trap. In Paris, the government fell. In Washington, Eisenhower's advisors were devastated. Nixon called it the worst decision of the administration. Radford believed his plan would have worked. Eisenhower wrote in his diary, "I believe I have prevented World War III." January 20th, 1961. John F. Kennedy placed his hand on the Bible and took the oath of office. He was 43, young, energetic. He spoke of a new frontier. He had not commanded armies. He had not read Ridgway's report. His advisors, many the same men who pushed Eisenhower, told him South Vietnam needed more support. Kennedy listened. By 1963, 16,000 advisors in Vietnam. Many flying combat missions. November 22, 1963. Kennedy was dead. LBJ escalated. August 1964. Gulf of Tonkin. Congress gave LBJ war powers. 1965. American combat troops deployed. 1968. 500,000 soldiers in Vietnam. The war cost 58,318 American lives, 300,000 plus wounded, $168 billion. Johnson's presidency. American unity. April 30th, 1975. North Vietnamese tanks crashed through Saigon Palace gates. After 20 years, after 58,000 dead, Vietnam unified under communist control. Everything Eisenhower predicted came true. The question Eisenhower asked in 1954 saved 58,000 lives. Kennedy never asked it. Johnson never asked it. And the difference is written on a black granite wall in Washington. 58,318 names. The hardest word a president can say is no.